Date with a Debut is a Words and Nerds and Breathe Art Podcasts co-production recorded on a Wagnical country. And I pay my respects to all elders, past and present, and extend that to any First Nations people tuning in. Always was, always will be, Aboriginal land. On with the show. Welcome to Date with a Debut, a podcast about debut authors, their incredible books, and their journey to publication. If you are looking for a new author to discover or writing inspiration for your own story and you don't know where to start, this is the place to be. I'm Nick Wasiliev, author of When Men Cry and your host for today's show, and I'm delighted to welcome another debut author in today's episode. If you enjoy this show, or indeed any other shows on the Words and Nerds platform, jump online and give us a thumbs up, a 5-star review, wherever you are listening. Thank you for listening to us and for supporting the Australian book industry. You can also find any books mentioned in today's podcast down in the description. Today, I'm joined by Trish Bolton, a Melbourne writer whose words have appeared in the likes of Overland, The Big Issue, the Sydney Morning Herald, the Canberra Times, and more. Today, we're talking about her debut novel, Whenever You're Ready, published by Allen and Unwin, which will be out now by the time you're listening to this. We will discuss very mild spoilers and won't spoil the ending for you, so I recommend you get yourself a copy of Whenever You're Ready down in the description box. Before we begin today's episode, I want to preface with a trigger warning. This book discusses topics of suicide and suicidal themes, so listener and reader discretion is highly advised. If you or someone you love is struggling with depression, know that you are not alone and help is available to you. You can contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. That number again, 13 11 14. So to kick us off, I asked Trish about her own writing journey.
Well, I suppose like many writers, I was a very early reader. So I was reading, really when I started primary school. And I read sort of really voraciously. And I think like many people of my age, the person that I really loved to read was Enid Blyton. I just could not get enough of Enid Blyton. So much so that my mother was terribly concerned by a certain age and all the Enid Blyton books were taken away because I just kept rereading them and rereading them. And she thought it was time that I moved on to someone else, which was probably quite true. And I used to read at night by a light that shone in from the bathroom. And I was in a bedroom with my two sisters and I was closest to the door. And so, I would read at night time until I really got caught. And then when I got caught, then I would sort of read under the blankets. I can't remember how I used to light the page, but I think it was probably with a little radio or something, a transistor radio that I had or something like that. So, I loved reading, but I never really thought of becoming a writer, as I know often, writers do. They sort of wanted to write since an early age. And then I came across Little Jo in Little Women, and I just loved her. I loved her because she, went against all the conventions and did her own thing, and because she wanted to be a writer. And I was, very swept up in that story. But I can't really say that I ever sort of saw myself as a writer, ever identified myself as a writer, and didn't see it as something that I would ever do. But I loved writing and I was very good at English and did really well at school in that subject. I won't say in all subjects. And I had an English teacher who said to me, one day you'll be a writer. And that was in year 9 and I was probably about 15 years old. And I still really didn't identify myself as being a potential writer. And then when I left school, it was in the days before you went and did a degree in journalism, and there was an advertisement. I think my parents may have passed it on to me. There was an advertisement in The Age, excuse me, asking for young people to apply for a cadetship. And And I did, and I didn't really think much of it. And I think it was a prize awarded to 2 or 3 boys and 2 or 3 girls. I can't really quite remember the details. And to my shock, I was invited in on a piece of writing that I'd submitted. And I had to do a general knowledge test, which I did really well because I was very interested in politics even then, and another piece of writing. And I was successful. And I didn't actually take that opportunity up. So I did sort of live to regret that a little bit. And my mother cried, I think, for weeks that I wouldn't take that opportunity. And I think it was just that I had nothing in my background that prepared me for that sort of work. You know, I thought of sort of becoming a nurse or a school teacher or something like that. And working at the age and being a journalist just was totally out of my sort of comfort zone and experience. So if I jump forward quite a few years, I went to uni as a mature age student because I didn't go to university after school. And I enrolled in media and communications, thinking that might be a pathway to journalism or that I could learn something about journalism. And then that sort of got hijacked along the way because I really did love study, research, being at university. I loved that whole experience. I think I was quite a good student. And I was probably that very annoying mature age student that always talked and had too much to say. And I went on to do some tutoring, and then I got a position lecturing in media and communications. And I was particularly interested in the intersection between media and politics. And so I would write around that. Plus I would also write around gender and gender representation. And I got quite a lot of pieces published, particularly in the Age, but in a number of different outlets. So so what happened after that? Well, quite a few years on, I had quite a big health scare, and which caused me to look at my life, I suppose. At that stage, I was enrolled in a PhD, and I was convening quite a number of subjects, had a big student load, was feeling the pressure really, and I just decided, no, I'm not going to do this anymore. And I gave up that very plum position of a permanent sort of position as a lecturer, which is so hard to get. Mm. And I enrolled in RMIT's creative writing degree, or it's a postgraduate degree now. It was a postgraduate diploma. I think it's an associate degree now. And again, thinking I'd sort of hone my sort of skills around journalism, and it was fiction that really got me, and that started me on that whole path. And I just thought, well, how much harder can it be than nonfiction? So
I love it.
That's a story that I will tell a little later, but yeah.
I absolutely love it, and I love as well that you just the journey that you went on. I still can't believe that your mum wouldn't told you that's enough, Enid. That's
seriously
enough.
I think I might have read each book about 7 times. That's just crazy.
That's the first time I've heard that. You're reading too much. Stop. No.
She wanted me to read other writers. Yeah,
it's fair, and I will say, being inspired by Little Women is I mean, I think I was very naughty in that my first I'd heard of Little Women, of course, a lot, but my first experience of it was actually the movie that came out a few years ago. And then that made me go and actually read the book. What a peach. What a peach of a story. It's a great book, and no wonder it inspires so many people. Yeah.
And the reason it's been made into a film so many times, I think. And I think that's great. If a film is great and it takes you to the book, that's terrific.
Absolutely. So let's talk about where this fiction journey led you. And it led you to this beautiful book right here, Whenever You're Ready, which at the time of us recording is not out, but when all of our listeners listen to it, it will be out in the world and you can buy it. So we're up to the part that you have dreaded in this podcast, as ahead of us talking. Give us your 1 minute pitch.
My 1 minute pitch. Yeah. Okay. So Whenever You're Ready is my love letter to older women. And as well as being about the friendship between women, it explores themes of aging and ageism, intergenerational grief, forgiveness, and redemption. Set in Melbourne, it tells the story of 3 women, Lizzie and Alice, both in their mid-70s and who've been friends since their uni days, and Margot, who was Lizzie's daughter. Told from each woman's perspective, we follow them as they deal with the unexpected death of a lifelong friend and the decades-long secret that death uncovers, which causes them to question their relationships with each other and their relationships with themselves.
Brilliant. Nailed it. I love it. And I think, judging by the subject matter, there's a lot to unpack in this book.
Yeah,
there's a lot to
in
unpack.
there.
And I must say, you let people know pretty quickly the sort of story it's going to be with that prologue with Claire. It immediately sets the tone. And particularly when it reveals that how she ended her life, and like mum and dad are both dead, and it really kind of sets in motion this chain reaction of how they all feel. As mentioned, you have Lizzie, you have her daughter, and Alice. The ground you cover is interesting. It is tough subject matter, but I will say that the way that you approached it with your writing was, sometimes it can be so dense that you just need to you need to put the book down and go for a walk afterwards. But I want to say that you cover these hard topics with kindness, which is something that is very hard to do. Some books can be so intense that you got to put them down, but this one, I just found myself reading it on about, as you cover ground on generational relationships and the regret that comes out of your past. And as you mentioned from the top, that if there's one thing that I got from this book, it is an examination of grief. You mentioned prior to us starting, when you were talking about your journey, that you had a health scare. How did this story come to you? Was it from that?
Well, I think part of the story does reflect that, but I think mostly it was my own aging, and also the reading that I was doing. I read sort of fairly widely, and I was just wondering where all the older women were in stories. Women in their 50s and 60s and 70s, and I think that is changing a little bit now. But nevertheless, we were sort of missing in action. But also, if I go back to my own aging, I think about 10 years ago, it sort of caught me quite by surprise that I was sort of looking back on my life. So I was in my late 50s then, and I was looking back on my life, and there was a sort of a really intense nostalgia, quite melancholic. And it's not that all the things that I was looking back on were unhappy things. It was just that feeling that time was gone, and all of that time was gone, and you just can't get it back. You can go back there, but you can't really get it back. And you also can see patterns then when you look back at I'd say a fairly long life. You can see patterns, your patterns. There's a sort of, I don't know, patterns of behaviour and it sort of takes you quite by surprise. You can actually see who you've been, and that makes you question about who you are now. And it also makes you think about who you want to be in those last 10, 20, you don't know, years of your life. So it did come from my own experience of aging, and then talking to other people who spoke about the same thing, that you do tend to sort of look back. There is a sort of a bit of a balance sheet, and probably we judge ourselves quite harshly too. And in my research, I found that there is, with older people, well, there is that looking back, but there is quite a lot of regret. And I think it's something that we don't talk about. It's something that we don't acknowledge, and older people don't talk about it either. So it's something that they carry with them. And I think that's a great shame that we don't acknowledge or talk about it. And and it's a sort of in a way, a burden that older people have to carry. And I'm not trying to suggest that being older is is an unhappy time. It's actually a very happy time in so many ways. But there is that fact that you have a long life behind you and you will examine it and there will be some regrets. And of course, there will be loss as well.
Yeah, and I feel like a great place to start on talking about this and what you're trying to examine is Lizzie. She has also experienced grief in her life before this moment, with the loss of her son. Which I'll try and keep this as spoiler free as I can. But I feel like this is something that doesn't spoil the ending. But she's also quite driven. She prioritizes her career and her self-development. And I love that this has also led to like a crafting. All of this has also created some sort of resentment in her relationship with Margot, to the point where she's actively trying to create distance between her and her mother. And I loved that it was kind of a sense where you could see the grief playing out in real time, in a way, not just because of Lizzie, who went through a sort of grief that would probably be the hardest grief of all, which is a parent losing their child, but also the challenge of the strange relationship that you have with your other children who are alive. But also for Margot, my head also was thinking, when I picked up on this subtext of kind of grief, thinking, when she's Lizzie's age, she's probably going to regret this as well. What was it like crafting that particular mother-daughter relationship?
Yeah, look, I found that really quite difficult. And initially, Margot was in the story really to provide a perspective on the older women and to have a sort of a generation gap thing. And I was going to play it fairly, it was going to be a much lighter story. And every time I got feedback, people were very interested in the relationship between Lizzie and Margot. And they just wanted me to go a lot deeper. And so deep I went. And
you did.
And it was also, I know a story about someone who did lose someone very close to them when they were younger, and they were also a child, and their parents really weren't there for them. And that's had a lifelong impact on that person. And so that story was pretty much inspired by that story that I've heard, and which I've had permission to play with. It's a very different story, but yeah, it just made me think about what would that be like to lose someone you really love and you're really quite young and your parents just aren't there for you at all emotionally. And I think that must have been sort of very, very difficult. So, yeah, that story played out with Margot and Lizzie. And Lizzie although she wants to have a closer relationship with her daughter, she is in some sort of denial about that time. And also, as we read on, we do find out that Lizzie had an awful lot to deal with herself at that time, not just the loss of her child. So I think really writing compassionately and understanding everybody's perspective and understanding everybody's experience is really what I wanted to do. So in the end, I wanted, I suppose, the reader to understand why Lizzie may have behaved as she did. And I wanted the reader also to understand that this was a terrible loss for Margot, a loss of her family, really, particularly when she was, virtually handed over to her mother's best friend. And, and so she doesn't trust her mother. She finds many things annoying about her mother, perhaps because she wants to. And they have very different life experiences. And it sort of plays out sort of really quite, badly for their relationship at the time that we meet them anyway.
Yeah, it's a heavy relationship, but I know that it would have been incredibly difficult to write, but bringing it back to the key thing that you've really nailed with this is that even despite this, you're kind with these characters in a way, because you're really trying to examine where each of them is sitting. And it is hugely helpful for the reader because it means that you get to sit with those characters and see where you're coming from, and even bring your own life experience into it, and your own relations that you've had with your own parents or friends, for that matter. There is, of course, another character that we hear from in this story. Shout out to Alice. I love her journey in this story. And I can see you, having mentioned, you said that there was, like, you originally wanted to play this book a little lighter. I do see that kind of come through a little bit more in this particular story. I just wanted to find out more about her in this book. She's great.
Yeah, she is great, Alice. She's great fun. So I did want to write about dark themes, and there are issues that Alice is dealing with in her life too that are really very difficult, that many older women deal with. But I really wanted to have that light touch, and I wanted to have some humour, because I think, as a reader, you need to have that little break, you need to have that little pause. So Alice was born. Yeah, where did she come from? I'm not quite sure. I wanted her to represent women who've perhaps lived a creative life with an uncertain income, whose income dependent on their looks, on their youth and their beauty, and what happens when that disappears. And also that she hadn't married, so she's never had that sort of financial stability of another partner. But like all my characters, she's really quite flawed too, but hopefully still very lovable. So that's where Alice came from. I was really struggled to find what sort of occupation could I have her in, but in the end I settled on a weather girl, and I had quite a lot of fun with that. Enjoyed writing that aspect of it. And then, all the different jobs that she had to sort of do just to sort of literally keep a roof over her head. So...
She's windswept and interesting. I just found her just so interesting. Is a great way to, I just such a fun character. But again, of course, she's also dealing with things in her life throughout this book. There's one kind of last thing I wanted to say, and I love that you kind of have this book as a love letter to older women. It's kind of the way you've described it, because one of the things, as mentioned at the top, is the thing that comes up in this book a lot is secrets, and secrets coming to light. We'll stay spoiler free, of course, on the ending. But there are a lot of secrets that a few characters, in this instance, took to the grave, and this becomes quite important. Often within previous books that I've read like this, there's usually some sort of subtext that telling the truth is a universal truth. It's a universal right. It's something that is the head of it. But often I find that can ignore the reality that some truths, if you tell them, can cause worse pain to some individuals. You've explored a lot in this book. You've explored a lot. And I always like to finish talking about these segments by asking authors what this examination taught you, not just about the processing of grief and the fact that, often when we look at death, you realize that death is about life and the life you left, but also about the truths and the lies that we tell each other. What did this book teach you?
The truth in relation to my characters, well, it was a dilemma. It posed quite a dilemma for Lizzie, and it had also posed quite a dilemma for the person that we meet in those first pages of the book that we don't really meet, again. So I think, sometimes there are some truths that we don't want to know, and they can cause, ripples of damage. But there is always a dilemma about keeping something that also affects people's lives, keeping that truth from them as well. So I don't know that there's an easy, excuse me, I don't know that there's I don't know that there's an easy answer to that question. And I think that whatever path you take, there's that sort of feeling that you are playing God with people's lives. But a secret is a heavy burden to carry around, I think. So what would I do if I had a secret? And I suppose I do have a couple. Generally, I think I would possibly, if I thought there was going to be harm caused by revealing that secret, I possibly would not reveal it. Yeah, but it just depends. I can't say.
It's a tough one it's a tough balancing act, and it's a tough question. But I just love that books endlessly examine this, and you did with yours, and it was really interesting. And I loved it. Let's talk about your journey to publication.
Oh, my journey to publication.
Yeah.
It was a long one. It was a long one. So I think I finished off saying before, when we were talking about my earlier life, my reading life and writing life, that I actually ended up going to RMIT, and I sort of discovered through short story, and then went into learn novel, that I really loved fiction. I had read voraciously, as I said, fiction when I was young, up until my sort of perhaps early 30s. And then when I sort of went into an academic career, it was all non-fiction. So there was quite a big gap for me. So really, I wanted to write fiction, but I had absolutely no idea what I was doing. And the RMIT creative writing classes were fantastic teachers there. And I learnt so much. And I did manage to get a short story published very soon after. And then I wrote a novel called Stuck, which actually turns out to have been a very appropriately titled novel, because I did get stuck with it. And I probably worked on it for way, way, way too long, because it kept winning unpublished prizes. It won a residency at Varuna, a Publishing Pathways Fellowship at Varuna, a couple of other unpublished novel long listings. It was long listed for the Dyslexia Women's Competition in the UK, and another quite well-known competition. But I really should have put it away. And I also, with that novel, I sent it out way too early. And if I've got any advice, is just never do that. And I had 3 very polished chapters. The first three chapters were fabulous, and the rest of it was not so fabulous. And I sent it out, and I just sent it everywhere, and including overseas. And I got, the first day that I'd sent it out, I had interest from a UK publisher. And then I had a phone call from an agent in New York.
As you do.
I just thought, wow, yeah, fantastic. And they both wanted the rest of the novel. And when they read the rest of the novel, that was it. They weren't interested, because it just wasn't ready to send out. So that's my advice. Don't send anything out too early. Anyway, I did eventually abandon that novel, and I started this one, I think, in about 2017, 2018. I was talking about it with an agent in 2017, and I think I had a first draft ready by the end of 2018. A very shitty first draft, a couple of very shitty first drafts, and I was pretty much told to go away and fix it up, which I tried to do. It was very flat on the page, and I just couldn't lift it, and I just didn't know what I was doing wrong. And then I sort of looked at my characters, and I thought, they've all got these amazing stories to tell. I'm going to let them tell them. And that's when I went from third person to multiple perspectives. And I hadn't even written a chapter, and I knew that it was working. Yeah. So, and then I won an ASA mentorship. And that mentorship was really quite, life-changing, I think, for me. So as well as getting to work with an editor, which was absolutely fabulous, she had a lot of confidence in the novel and in the story. And so I met with her, and she told me, all the things that needed to be looked at, and the sort of work that needed to be done, and sent me away for 12 months. And I did that work, and we met again, and she was very enthusiastic about it, which was just so uplifting. because, rejection is just sort of, it's a hard thing to take. And so when you get someone that's enthusiastic, it's like, oh, yeah, what is it they do on the bear? It's sort of like this. Whether you've seen the bear, but they do this sort of thing. And so very shortly after I started sending it out, I couldn't get an agent, which was very disappointing. And I'd sent it off to a couple of publishers, and I was much more careful the way I actually sent it out this time. And I'd had a couple of rejections. That was still with quite a number of publishers. And when I sent it to Allen and Unwin, sort of a dream publisher, and I didn't really expect to hear anything. And I did follow up fairly quickly, I think about 4 weeks after I'd sent it, because I just wanted to hear them say, no, look, we don't want it. And then I would just move on.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, the person I spoke to said, oh, look, could we get back to you in a fortnight? And I thought that sounded different and a little bit hopeful, but I didn't really think about it. And they did get back to me in a fortnight, and they, a few days later, made an offer, which was just brilliant. And about a day or two after that, I found out that someone else was going to make an offer as well. So,
wow.
Yeah, so that's
what a journey.
But that took quite a few years.
What a journey. I love it, though, that there's like, and also
years, yeah. So.
Yeah, and I love as well that this is also like your second book. You had like a book that was there and then it wasn't, and then you kind of, I love as well your advice on making sure it's ready before you send it out to people.
Every word.
That's every word.
Chapter.
And I also love that you how much you enjoy the editing process. I think I've spoken about this in a lot of episodes that I've done, and just for me, it doesn't get better. The book really doesn't. It turns from a pile of slop to a book once the editor shows up. Pretty much, it's the best process.
So true. A really well-known writer once told me that she never became a writer until she worked with an editor.
Yeah,
and I think that's true. Yeah,
absolutely.
So they're unsung heroes, and I love the conversation that you have with editors, and the toing and froing, and where you sort of end up. And even sometimes when you don't quite take on exactly what they have suggested, what it actually does is open up all new possibilities. And that happened a few times for me in the restructuring and copy edit of this novel, and I'm very sort of grateful for it.
Absolutely.
In fact, some of the best work came out of the ideas that feedback generated.
I think it's the best process, and it just makes your book. It sends it to the stratosphere every single time. It does.
You're too close to it to do that yourself.
Exactly. What's next for you? Do we have another book coming?
I do, but I haven't written very much of it. It's quite a different novel, but women will still be at its centre. But it's, I'm interested in exploring climate change. I'm also interested in having a very different narrator, a tree as a narrator. So
wow,
So the tree, great. A very, very old tree who can look back at different waves of settlement in Australia.
Oh, that sounds fascinating.
But also, definitely with women at the centre, because I love writing about women.
I'm also sensing another subtext about looking back at the past as well. And similarly,
well, certainly our history, Australian history, the past to the present. Yeah.
I love it, and oh my god, I'm gonna have to wait with bated breath for that one. Please keep going. Keep that one.
You might be waiting a while.
Look, I will. We are patient.
I'm keen to do it. Yeah.
We're patient. We're at the part of the podcast, the final part, where I hit you with a bunch of rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So I'm going to fling them at you, and you just give me the first answer that comes to your head. You've only had prep for 2, which are questions about books. First and foremost. And the first one is, what is your favorite? You are a voracious reader. What's your favorite book that you've read in the last 12 months?
My favourite book is Never Look Desperate by Rachel Matthews. Do you know of it?
No, I don't.
I've only just finished it. It came out last year, so it's been out about maybe 12 months, maybe a bit less than that. It's just really everything, that book. It's everything I like in book. It's got pathos, so it can make you laugh and cry on the same page, sometimes in the same line, yet it's not sentimental. It's about ordinary people, and I really like books about ordinary people. And it's about the beauty and tragedy of the human condition. And it's a really wonderful book, and it has there are two younger protagonists, but there is an older woman, Goldie, and she's absolutely wonderful and terribly flawed and also terribly wonderful. So yes, I do love that book, Never Look Desperate.
Oh, I love it. I'm going to have to check it out now. I haven't heard of that one.
Yeah. It's really, really good.
It sounds like it. What is your favourite debut that you've ever read?
Can I have two?
Of course you can have two.
Madeline St. John's Women in Black, The Women in Black. It's it's quite a few years since I've read it, but it's a very sweet story. It's set in a department store, and a young, very working class, naive girl goes to work there, and she sort of learns about the world. And it's just a very sweet, sweet story, beautifully written. I think Madeline St. John. In fact, I think there's a series coming up on Stan that actually, I'm not sure that it is exactly the story of the Women in Black, but it bounces off from that. And my other one is another female writer is Harp in the South by Ruth Park. Do you know of her?
I do know Ruth Park.
Yeah, that's set just post World War II in the Sydney slums, Surrey Hills, which I'm sure aren't slums anymore. And it's a really wonderful story and very, very moving. And it actually starts off with the loss of her little boy, really virtually on the first page. He just sort of disappears. So they're my two stories. Yeah.
I love it. Do you have a favourite word?
Discombobulate.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a nice word.
Because even if you've never heard of the word, I just think you know what it means when you hear it.
It's also really satisfying to say. It's fun to say.
Yeah. I actually wanted to have it a couple of times in my novel, but my editor wielded her pen. I liked it so much, I just wanted to use it in so many situations.
You should have done like a counter of how many times you used discombobulate in your original draft.
It wouldn't have been more than 3, but 3 was probably too much because it's not a word that you'll forget.
No, it isn't.
She used that 30 pages ago. So
yeah. Where is your favourite place to read? And out of curiosity, is it still in bed under the covers like you were when you were younger?
Well, I do have a partner who gets very annoyed about how long the light burns at night time, but I do. Yeah, my favourite place is bed. Yeah, it's a cocoon, and I'll even go there during the day sometimes on top of the bed, and I like the luxury of it. Yeah, and the quietness of it, and that's where I do a little bit of reading otherwise, but bed is where I'll always go for my serious reading.
I love it. Do you have a favourite beverage that you like to read with?
A cup of tea. English breakfast. Yeah, tea is good.
Have a particular technique. Yeah. And then the last question, which is a bit more intense, but given the subject matter of the book, it feels relevant. Again, as we've mentioned, this book has taught you a lot as much as it has been an experience for all of us. And it really makes you look back in your life in new ways and interesting ways. What is your meaning of life?
Oh, gosh, that's a big one. What is the meaning of life, of my life? I think the meaning that I've arrived at, I'm quite inspired by the writer George Saunders, who talks about when he looks back on his life, what he thinks about are the failures of kindness. And that's something I think about quite a lot. And I'm sure I've had many failures of kindness in my life. And so for me, I hate to say going forward, but for me, however many years I have left, I want to be, kindness, compassion. I just think they're just such important qualities. They can make, there's small things, but they can make such a difference to life every day. Yeah. So I don't know whether that's a really good, very good answer or a very thoughtful answer, but
I think it is. I think that's a very thoughtful answer.
Yeah.
Even if, like, some people may view some answers as predictable, but I personally think that with context, having the experience of it, it reevaluates what is actually important.
Yeah.
In the greater scheme of things of the time that you're on this planet. Thank you so much, Trish. This has been a lot of fun, and thank you for writing this amazing book.
Thanks so much, Nick. It was great.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Date with a Debut, and for listening to the Words and Nerds channel. You can buy all books mentioned in today's episode down in the description box, and if you enjoyed the show, or indeed any episode of Words and Nerds, drop us a review, leave us 5 stars or a thumbs up. It is hugely appreciated. Catch you for another date soon.